known as Integrity, which focused on corruption within the private sector. And he also pioneered and pushed for players in that sector who were abhorrent and uncomfortable with what was happening to sign a pact to say we will not bribe for business. And that initiative took on a life of its own, and it is still operating and working with the private sector. So this is a subject matter that the acting president is very, very comfortable with. So ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure and honor to invite Professor Yemi Osinbajo, SAN, to give a speech and to declare this conference open. Your Excellency, sir.
Very much. Please sit. Members of the Federal Executive Council present, the chairman of the Presidential Advisory Committee Against Corruption, Professor Ishe Sage, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, the keynote speaker, Mr. Akere Muna, members of the Advisory Committee Against Corruption, heads of government agencies, former chairman of EFCC and chairman of session, Malam Nuhu Ribadu, Your Excellencies of the Diplomatic Corps, our friends and partners who are present here, heads of government agencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first say that it is a very special pleasure to be here and also to participate in this conference. I must say that I have participated in several conferences of this sort, but I have never participated in any where we're actually talking about recovery of stolen assets and how to cooperate on the issue of recovery of stolen assets. And I say this with a measure of nostalgia, because years ago, at a conference organized by the Transparency International in Peru, I believe it was in 1995 or so, we who came from African countries and developing countries that were intent on identifying what to do with proceeds of corruption and ensuring that proceeds of corruption were described as dirty money and as such were criminalized, and that the whole process of passing around proceeds of corruption will be criminalized. We went there with an agenda, and we thought that we'll be able to convince everyone else that the proceeds of corruption was indeed dirty money, and that banks, financial institutions, everybody alike, should treat it as such. But in Peru, it just didn't fly. You know, we were heavily outnumbered in terms of those who felt that proceeds of corruption should be treated differently. At this time, many of the countries, many of the developing countries, had treaties, conventions, bilateral agreements where drug money, narcotics, proceeds of corruption, proceeds of drugs and narcotics, trafficking in drugs and narcotics, had already been described as dirty money. So you couldn't, as a bank, accept such money. That would be considered pure money laundering, and you'd be punished for it. There were all sorts of international sanctions in the conventions. But somehow, proceeds of political corruption just didn't attract the outrage that proceeds of drugs or narcotics attracted. So it took years and years and years before anyone would listen and agree that when somebody loots the resources of a country and deprives millions of people of the means by which they would even make a decent existence, that is even more criminal. That is a crime against humanity, possibly even worse than trafficking in drugs. But it's a good thing that we're here now, many, many decades after, able to talk about this, and we're joined by all of those who, or all of our partners and friends who also agree that this is a serious enough issue and that we should find ways of ensuring that not only are these assets criminalized properly, the transfer of these assets criminalized, but also that they are returned to their appropriate owners. I wonder how many people, I'll just talk very briefly about the whole idea that this cannot happen. The transfer of these assets up and down the place cannot happen without a handshake, if you like, between the countries where they are transferred and the institutions and countries to which they are transferred, especially the financial institutions. There is no way that it will happen without some form of connivance between international banking institutions and those who transfer these funds. So we must work at somehow delegitimizing those kinds of transactions and criminalizing them. So just as Mr. Keremuna said, so that banks and financial institutions that are engaged in this are actually called out and they are made to face the consequences of engaging in criminal conduct. If that isn't done, then we're not likely to get very far. I don't know how many people ever heard of the story, just talking about the collaboration, or connivance, if you like, you know. I don't know whether anyone ever heard of the story of Ignatius Clean. Does anyone ever hear that story of Ignatius? Actually, it was a story told by J.K. Randall, but it became the subject of a major controversy because the same story was retold by a British author in a book, and he didn't credit J.K. Randall, so J.K. Randall went to courts and sued, and I think a settlement was eventually reached. But I'm telling this story, giving credit to J.K. Randall, so I won't be sued by him. What happened, he told the story of a certain African head of state, or no, African public official, let's not say head of state, who went to a bank, a Swiss bank. He had heard about this Swiss banker who was supposed to be, you know, in the days when Swiss banks were had secrecy laws and those kinds of things. And this particular Swiss banker was supposed to be one of the best, you know. So he went to him, you know, had a big box, went to him, and then pointed a gun at his head. He said to him, I am told that you have resources of our country, that you are keeping money belonging to my country, that you are keeping money for many corrupt people. The banker kept quiet, didn't say anything. Then Mr. Ignatius brought out a gun and pointed it at his head. He said, if you don't tell me now how many people you have been keeping money for, people from my country who you have been keeping, if you don't tell me now, I'm going to shoot you. And the banker looked down and said, I am bound by secrecy laws. I cannot tell you. I'd rather die than tell you. Then Mr. Ignatius sat down and said, you are the banker I've been looking for. I have some money for you to keep. So there must be collaboration. There must be some connivance. There must be some connivance. And it is this connivance, I think, that we should first go for. We must find the ways, and I think that a lot of the bilateral type agreements and talks that we should be engaging in, and the conventions that we should be looking forward to signing in the coming years, must be those that work hard at ensuring that financial institutions are not given a free run. Financial institutions are key to all of this, and whatever we do, we must hold financial institutions accountable. The other point I'd like to make, just to round this up, is that African countries and developing countries also must realize that it is our responsibility. It's our responsibility to ensure that we not only get this money, that we not only find where this money is, trace this money, but that we make sure that this money is returned. It's our responsibility. It's easy enough to talk about how difficult it is sometimes to get these funds, and that has already been identified. Most nations that you have to deal with are either just reluctant or don't think it's really their business, and many have civil processes anyway that make it difficult for you to return money, So, and they just simply tell you that, look, our courts are handling this matter. There's very little we can do about it. And that's really the way these things go. But I think that it's our responsibility to make it a national cause, a cause for developing countries, and to ensure that we make all of the other countries of the world have the same kind of outrage that they've had, that has been developed when with drug money, with terrorist financing, and all of that. We are the ones who must ensure that everybody is as outraged by this as we are. If we don't ensure that people are as outraged by it as we are, we're not going to get very far. No matter what we say, every country will protect its financial institutions, protect its own institutions as best as it can, and so long as it is not necessarily, suffering any major damage, they probably would not cooperate. But I think it's up to us African countries to insist and to fight at every forum to make sure that we are emphasizing this point and that we are calling out those institutions that are not cooperating and ensuring that they recognize that this, for us, is a major issue. As I keep saying, corruption for Nigeria and for countries like us is an existential problem. If we don't solve the problem of corruption, it's President Buhari who has said this repeatedly, if we don't kill corruption, corruption will kill us. That is the same for most African countries. It's the same. And when corruption finds safe havens, when corrupt money finds safe havens, it is emboldened and is able to fight back. We are experiencing in Nigeria a situation where corruption fights back, and fights back so persuasively, so eloquently sometimes, and with such resources that government itself, if government is not careful, it can be overwhelmed. And it is because the resources have safe havens everywhere. There is no, if you look at the anti-corruption fight in Nigeria, you can tell that there is a major fight back. There's a media war against the fight against corruption. You will find people who will put stories in the media that suggest that there is something wrong with fighting corruption. People will tell you, for instance, that, look, it's all media trials. That is a media trial. I don't know what that means. If you discover, for example, large sums of money are discovered in a place, there's nowhere in the world where it will not make the news. There's nowhere in the world. If you go and find somebody who puts large sums of money in an air-conditioned room, there's nowhere in the world where it will not make news. There's nowhere in the world. So this whole idea of trying to delegitimize the anti-corruption struggle is definitely fueled and funded by those who have these resources, who have stolen these resources. And I think it's important for us to understand that unless we see it as an existential problem for us, unless we as Africans, we as Nigerians see it as a problem that can bring down all of our systems, we're never going to be able to fight. We're never going to be able to fight against corruption. And I think that this is a point which I hope we will be able to advance, especially with other African countries. If you look at the Thabo Mbeki report, the Thabo Mbeki report shows that most of the illicit financial flows that come out of Africa come from Nigeria. And that is, so evident in some of the figures that they give. And I think that shows us very clearly, especially those of us who are concerned with law enforcement in Nigeria, that we simply have to do more. We have to work harder, because it is evident that so much money is leaving our shores, so much money is leaving our resources. I was arguing with a certain gentleman who works, a friend of mine who works with one of our development partners, about their stopping funding for a certain project. I don't want to describe the details, so you don't know who it is. But so he kept telling me about how, well, we're no longer, Nigeria is no longer a poor country, we're now a middle-income country, that kind of stuff. So they shouldn't really be giving us those types of grants and all that. And I was quite, and I, of course, insisted that even before you cut off those kinds of flows, you must give us notice, this and that. Finally agreed that I had made a sufficiently good point and that they might consider continuing to give the money. Not so long after that, in fact, I think it was barely a week after that, when some large sum of money was found in Kaduna, which was roughly about half of the money that we were asking for. So he sent me this text, which showed just a text that said this money had been discovered somewhere. Of course, I didn't reply the text. Then he sent it again, I didn't reply. Then I called him. Is this your idea of a joke or what? I mean, but clearly, there's something to be, it is sometimes absurd, when we are asking for aid, and this comes back to the whole idea of the SDGs. When you're asking for aid and so much money, much larger sums of money than the aid you're asking for, is actually going out of the country. So I think that there's a sense in which we ourselves must take responsibility for our problems and ensure that we do something about it. Having said this, I will close by commending this initiative of the Presidential Advisory Committee Against Corruption, in collaboration with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Justice, and the government of the Kingdom of Norway, and of course, all our development partners and institutions who have worked hard to bring this event to fruition. It is now my special pleasure to declare this conference open. Thank you very much.
Osinbajo, SAN just declared the event open. You re-emphasize the fact that Nigerians need to collectively come together to fight corruption. Otherwise, it will fight back, especially if it has a safe haven. Having declared the event open, it will now move into technical sessions where important issues, including